You're tuning into the Real Estate Diversification Podcast, hosted by trusted and experienced real estate attorneys who are also seasoned real estate investors themselves. Are you ready to explore unique real estate investing opportunities? Ready to learn about emerging trends and new ideas? Your hosts will help you understand the practical and legal complexities of a myriad of real estate investments so that you can maximize your potential and achieve financial freedom. Now, listen in and get ready to learn.
Welcome back, Red Podcast Nation. I am your host for today, Jonathan Gilmore. Today, I am here to talk with you about the wonderful investing world of glamping operations. Now, what is glamping? You might ask. If you don't already know, glamping is a marriage of two words, glamorous and camping. This isn't your kind of run-of-the-mill camping operation that you can invest in where someone goes out and pitches a tent and sleeps on the ground, okay? Glamping is a unique opportunity for a guest to enjoy the outdoors without sacrificing monitored amenities, okay? So the several different types of glamping operations. You've got safari tents. As it may sound, these are those large canvas tents with sturdy frames, raised off the ground and furnished with real beds, linens, and other comforts. You've got tree houses, right? These are elevated structures made of wood that are raised off the ground, often featuring multiple levels and stunning views of a very unique location. You've got yurts. You may look it up and Google it, right? These are round tent-like structures. They're made of wood or canvas. They're often furnished with a bed or and heating, cooling amenities, as well as some cooking facilities, okay? You also have Airstreams, okay? You probably can imagine what your vintage Airstream looks like. Now they're about $75,000, $80,000, $100,000 for a high-end Airstream, right? These are stunning modern trailers, oftentimes refurbished, upgraded. They have comfortable beds. They have full kitchens. They have bathrooms. Another type of glamping accommodation is geodesic domes, right? If you imagine being in Iceland, with Aurora Borealis, right? These are domes that encompass the entire living space. They are glass topped oftentimes, right? You can see the stars. You can lay under the stars. It is a unique, special experience that only a handful of people get to enjoy, and they're willing to pay for it, okay? Speaking of willing to pay for it, here's some of the investment pros of glamping and a glamping operation, okay? The COVID-19 pandemic taught us that, especially Americans, we want to travel. We don't have to hop on a plane, but we want to go somewhere special. We want to go with our family, or we want to go with our significant other, and we want to go somewhere cool, right? All right. So because of that, there's growing demand in this space. It's unique. You've probably seen it on HGTV. It's been featured on Magnolia and Discovery Channel, other networks that have home building shows. Well, glamping is an operation. It's a hospitality operation that's featured on these. And because of that, there's increased demand. Okay, so that's one pro. The other one, it's really good potential for high returns for an investor. And why is that? Well, I just talked about some of these wonderful, unique places that you can go stay. I've talked about tree houses. Okay, imagine being in California during Coachella, staying in an Airstream at a glamping campground. How many thousands of dollars a night do you think someone's willing to pay for that small window to be a part of that festival and to live in style while you're there? Think about being in summertime on the Front Range, the foothills of Colorado, the Rocky Mountains, being able to stay in a unique, safe escape while having amazing views, breathtaking atmosphere. How many thousands of dollars will people pay for that? That is a big reason why there's a high probability for profitability in this market space. Another thing is, well, oftentimes these glamping campgrounds can fully amenitize and basically charge, okay, either build into the nightly cost or have additional costs built in. Think about golf cart rental. Think about gaming centers, mini golf. Think about water sports rentals. If you're near a body of water, you have a boat rental. You have kayak, canoe rentals, things like that, where for an additional fee, people can stay on site, stay on resort, if you will, and enjoy themselves. Okay. You've got mountain biking in Colorado, like I mentioned, cruiser bikes in California, dining establishments, even, you have your own staff to fully furnished meals, which is oftentimes included in this, but then have a separate dining experience. Maybe it's not where you're staying, but somewhere you can go to the point of of a peninsula, right, in Florida, where you can enjoy the dolphins while you eat. That's part of this resort experience. That is a glamping experience. So this is unique. This is a unique hospitality class, and it's drawing national interest. And those are some of the reasons why I think could be considered a good investment, right? Some of the cons here, some of the negatives or challenges involving this asset class is it's high upfront, high entry costs. Okay. Land acquisition can be expensive. You want to maximize the time frame of when you can operate this property. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but some barriers to entry are land costs or leasing costs, which is another challenge in and of itself. You don't want to lease an operation from a landowner for 2 years if you plan on operating it for 10. So there's that additional challenge, right? Which is, how do you own the property if you own the property? There's capital expenditures. Even if you buy an existing campground and want to soup it up for a glamping experience, you still have to spend money on import dirt. You have to spend money on landscaping, things like that, maintenance, etc. All the beautiful amenities I just said as a way to increase and boost profitability. That's also a con, right? Because you have to have upfront costs to build these amenitized centers, or you can build as you go. But if you start out with no amenities, you're less likely to gain the type of guests and maybe charge the cost you want to charge. So obviously you can build that as you go along. So utilities, making sure that you have the proper utilities and the proper infrastructure for some of these types of glamping operations can also be a challenge. If you think about the example in Colorado, can you get water there? Does it have water? Or what about electricity? If you just buy someone's farmland, there are probably no utilities. There's no horizontal infrastructure in place, no sewer, no running water. What's it going to cost to get that to that location? Some instances, if you find the right spot, it's already there. If you buy an existing campground, you've actually jumped over a couple of the challenges, some more that we'll talk about. But those are few and far between. And also, they may not be in the location that you want them to be in to offer this highly amenitized, highly profitable investment opportunity. So another con to glamping is it's a seasonal business, just like camping, but maybe more so in some areas, right? So you've got peak dates. I mentioned this earlier for land acquisition. You've got time frames such as I live in the Midwest. In the wintertime, I don't think anyone's going to want to go out and entertain a glamping experience when it's 3 degrees outside. So for that reason, a lot of these glamping operations or some of the more profitable ones, they're open, they're 300 days a year, right? Maybe even more than that. Those are in locations, California, Southern Texas, Florida, where you can actually, Sunbelt locations, right? Where you can maximize the nights that you can offer rentals to guests. Well, the landowners in these areas know that. So the basis is higher, which thus limits the barrier to entry for several types of investors, right? So if you can find that right spot, it's less of a challenge, but it takes more time to do that, right? To get it for the right price. Another thing with seasonality is your glamping structures aren't actually structures in a lot of instances. They could be a safari tent or a yurt. Do they have to be taken down in the off season? Some operators choose not to take them down and try to winterize them. Well, and then a snowstorm hits. There was a snowstorm recently in California, right? If your glamping operation is out there, did your Airstream get knocked over? God forbid, right? But if you had a tent or a yurt, did it get blown away? Were you even prepared for that? In some areas, they get disassembled, they get removed, they get closed down for the season. But inclement weather can affect this type of business operation. So another con is scalability. There's oftentimes limited scalability. You just said that we're in unique areas, right? We're in off the beaten path areas. Well, because of that, are you going to be able to expand? Can you bring in utilities like I mentioned? Can you bring in dirt? Can you get subcontractors up in the mountains or out, in a wooded area where you have treehouse amenities? A lot of times these hurdles can be easily addressed if you're creative planning, right? If you're able to, during your due diligence process as to whether you want to acquire land and start an operation in a certain area, you're going to have to sort this out and vet this to make sure that this is doable. And that's a lot of times a hurdle that some investors don't, the juice isn't worth the squeeze for certain investors, but for some it is. So the final hurdle that I want to talk about today are regulatory hurdles. This is an issue that might be most important. Okay. In a lot of these areas, you have to obtain permits and you have to make sure you have the right permits to operate this type of business. So, and this kind of really ties into the legal challenges and legal considerations while running and starting a glamping operation. Okay, the first, as I mentioned, is zoning. So, glamping is often subject to local zoning laws and regulations. These vary from one jurisdiction to another. But just generally, zoning laws, they often include specific classifications for different types of properties like residential, commercial, industrial, and it can be challenging to classify a glamping operation into one of these existing zoning categories. So for that reason, what is often required or sometimes required is a special use permit or a conditional use permit. Okay, there's just some differences between the two, but generally speaking, special use permits allow for uses that are considered special or unique and require a more detailed review process, whereas conditional use permits are typically used for uses that are conditionally allowed within a zoning district, but require certain conditions to be met before they are permitted. Okay, so as it relates to the review process, special use permits typically require a more detailed review process than conditional use permits typically, right? The review process may involve public hearings, community input, and maybe a more extensive analysis of the potential impact of the proposed use of the business glamping operation in this instance. So you can imagine if you want to put a geodesic dome structure near a Disneyland or Disney World, some theme park, right? Well, places like that already have their own hospitality, amenitized lodgings. Okay. So if you want to tap into that, maybe you have to be far enough out to where that, which will be the largest neighbor, that neighbor's input doesn't sway the local council as to whether you're going to be allowed or given a special use permit. Okay. Conditional use permits, kind of similar as far as the process. It may require a public hearing, may also require community input, but maybe it's a little less intensive than a special use permit. And special use permits, if granted, they typically have a set period. Maybe you have to get them renewed annually. Maybe it's every 3 years. Just depends on the jurisdiction. But when you get special use permits renewed, you got to make sure you get them renewed, right? Because that could also be that's a challenge, right? Of having a special use permit expire and still having an ongoing operation. Because then maybe the approving individuals who were part of the jurisdiction who initially granted that special use permit, maybe they're not there anymore. Okay, so that's another challenge, I guess, an operational hazard, right? Is to make sure that the conditional or special use permit, is maintained. Conditional use permits are similar, but oftentimes they are granted for the life or use of the operation. So maybe a little less problematic, but still something to be aware of. So the one thing about zoning, this is key. Zoning is not an issue. It's not an area where you want to ask for forgiveness later. Okay. This is one where you need to ask for permission on the front end. There's lots of horror stories out there where people who run operations like this or other hospitality-based operations, they don't get permission. They think that they're going to ask for forgiveness. They don't get it. It tanks their business model. So I think it's very important that you get with a seasoned professional, whether it's consulting or legal professional, that's able to analyze what the current zoning laws are and whether you need a special use and or conditional use permit prior to starting this operation, maybe prior to acquiring the land. I mean, I would highly recommend that just becomes part of an investor's due diligence checklist, right? So, in addition to zoning laws and permitting, you also might have environmental challenges from the legal side. So this could be, the glamping operation could be subject to a variety of environmental regulations, waste disposal, water usage, impact on wildlife and natural habitats. And so you may need to get a separate additional permit in and of itself to address those concerns or challenges. So another, legal consideration that you should look at when investing in this type of operation is property owners' legal right to actually operate it. So zoning aside, environmental, federal, other uses aside, is your property, do you have the ability by a mortgage holder or some other business entity to even operate it as a glamping operation? So for instance, think about you buy a farm, you're running it as a farm for several years, and then you decide to switch to a glamping operation, but you still have a note, right? You still have loan documents that says this is the commercial purpose for this loan is to operate it as a farm, okay? And then you want to switch. Is that operational switch? Is that something that the loan documents will allow you to do? Sure, you can do it, but is this a permission versus forgiveness situation? Maybe asking for forgiveness is an impossibility if you're late on a loan payment and they notice that you switched the business operation. Oh, and their loan documents contain a provision that says this loan is intended for farm use only. Any switch in operational use must be approved by the lender, or else the default it triggers a default clause or an acceleration provision. So if you want to make that conversion, and I have clients who have analyzed making conversion from farm property to glamping operations. And that is something that you have to look at the front end, because you might want to get lender's permission. Or maybe you don't. Maybe you don't need to get permission, but at the very least, you should look into it. So the other consideration I would talk about operationally, there's a couple. The first is, what kind of agreements do you have with your guests? So these, glamping is hospitality based. It kind of looks like a hotel, but it kind of looks like a campground. What you want to avoid are holdover tenants. So a lot of operations like this, they don't use leases at all. They use rental agreements. They call them rental agreements. They don't call them lease agreements for obvious reasons, right? So you have a guest stays there, like with the hotel, you book for a certain amount of nights, and then after that, your stay is over. You want to make sure that your agreements are properly drafted. And that your models are properly prepared so that you don't have an issue of somebody who wants to stay long term when you had them down as short term. So because you want to avoid any potential evictions issues, things like that with your operations. So just generally, another challenge or consideration legally is make sure you have the right liability protection when it comes to glamping operations. First and foremost, you want to make sure that any operation is incorporated, LLC or likewise, that prevents limited liability to the investor or the owner. And you might want to even house the actual glamping operation in one LLC and the land acquisition in another LLC. That way you have those separate, distinct, and maybe you have an agreement between the two, which kind of highlights or sets out the terms. Maybe there's a lease amount paid from your operations to your landowner. But in any event, you want to have at least one LLC, generally speaking, that prevents personal liability to the owner. Another thing is just general injuries or damages created by guests or third parties. You want to make sure you have signage that's up, don't play here, don't go down this path, things like that. And finally, you want to make sure that you have proper liability insurance and the like. So just depending on where your operation is, hopefully, maybe you need flood insurance. We don't know. It's all site specific, but those are just some general kind of legal considerations you're going to want to take as well. So in any event, we've covered quite a bit of information today, and this is just kind of your overview on the glamping operation investment opportunity. There's a lot of legal concerns that can be there, but there's a lot of potential for profits so long as you address some of the considerations I discussed, and you kind of get out in front of the potential cons that I discussed earlier. So I think that's it. Thank you for your time today. And until next time, invest wisely.
Thanks for listening to the Real Estate Diversification Podcast. Did you enjoy the episode? Visit www.rediversification.com to tune in to more exciting episodes and free information and tools that will help you succeed. Leave us a review and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and our other social media channels at the RED Podcast. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. Missouri Bar Advertising Disclosure. Neither the Supreme Court of Missouri nor the Missouri Bar reviews nor approves certifying organizations or specialist designations. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely upon advertisements.